The question of which year the first Five Nights at Freddy's game takes place in has been debated for years by fans because the series intentionally hides clear dates and instead scatters small clues across paychecks, phone calls, newspapers, and later games. When you analyze these clues carefully, a fairly consistent picture emerges. Most evidence points toward the events of the first game happening in the early 1990s, and the strongest single candidate is the year 1993. Reaching that conclusion requires examining the paycheck details, the work schedule, the technological environment of the restaurant, and the broader timelines suggested by later entries in the series. One of the most important pieces of evidence comes from the paycheck the player receives at the end of the first game. In the game, the player works as a night guard named Mike Schmidt at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. At the end of the workweek, a paycheck appears showing the amount earned and the date issued. The amount of money paid for the week is $120, with an additional overtime bonus if the player completes an extra shift. What matters more than the amount, however, is the date printed on the check. The paycheck shows a date in November with the day written as 12. While the year itself is not shown, the schedule of the workweek gives a strong hint about it. The years in earlier decades also have that alignment. The technological setting and other lore details make those alternatives far less likely. Another major factor supporting the 1993 theory is the level of technology shown in the restaurant. The security office uses closed-circuit cameras connected to a small monitor system that the guard flips through manually. The interface is simple, with static interference and grainy images. This style of surveillance equipment was common in small businesses during the late 1980s and early 1990s. It is advanced enough to allow multiple cameras, but not modern enough to resemble digital surveillance systems that became more common in the 2000s. The use of physical doors controlled by simple buttons and a limited power system also fits with a somewhat older infrastructure rather than a newer corporate installation. This atmosphere of decline matches the idea that Freddy Fazbear's Pizza had already gone through several earlier incidents before the first game begins. To understand the year more clearly, it helps to look at the timeline implied by later entries in the franchise. Later games describe an earlier location operating during the late 1980s and possibly before that. Those games include references to the so-called Bite of 87, an infamous incident involving an animatronic attack that severely injured someone. The first game's phone calls mention this event in a way that suggests it happened in the past, but not extremely long ago. If the bite occurred in 1987, then placing the first game roughly 6 years later in 1993 makes narrative sense. The restaurant could have reopened or continued operating after the incident, but slowly declined over time. The wage shown on the paycheck also loosely aligns with the minimum wage environment of the early 1990s in the United States. The federal minimum wage in 1993 was $4.25 per hour. If a night guard worked a limited number of hours during overnight shifts across 5 nights, the weekly pay shown in the game becomes more plausible. It is not a perfect match, but it sits in a believable range for a low-paid security position during that era. The game likely simplified the numbers for clarity, but the general scale of the paycheck fits that time period better than earlier decades. Another subtle clue comes from the general design of the animatronics themselves. Characters such as Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy resemble mascots from family entertainment restaurants that were popular in the 1980s and early 1990s. Real-world establishments like those that featured singing animatronic bands had a similar aesthetic. By the mid-1990s, those attractions were already beginning to fade in popularity as arcades and new entertainment trends took over. The somewhat worn and outdated look of the characters in the game fits with the idea that the restaurant belongs to that fading era of animatronic-themed dining. Environmental storytelling also reinforces the sense that the building is old and poorly maintained. The walls are stained, the office equipment looks outdated, and the animatronics appear to have been repaired many times. This suggests that the establishment has been running for years without major upgrades. If the restaurant originally opened in the 1980s, then a setting in the early 1990s would represent the tail end of its lifespan before eventual closure. The narrative of the missing children incident also plays a role in determining the timeline. In the first game's newspaper clippings, reports mention that several children disappeared at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza and that a suspect was arrested. The restaurant continued operating afterward, but suffered severe reputational damage. Later games imply that these disappearances occurred years earlier, not immediately before the events of the first game. Placing the original crime in the mid to late 1980s and the security guard job in 1993 creates enough time for the story to develop into urban legend among employees. When combining all these pieces of evidence together, the year 1993 becomes the most coherent placement. The paycheck date aligns with the calendar, the wage roughly fits the economic context, the technological level matches the early 1990s, and the law references point to several incidents that happened years earlier. While the game itself never explicitly prints the year, the surrounding clues converge strongly toward that point in time. There are alternative interpretations proposed by some fans. A few theories argue that the game might take place slightly earlier, such as in the late 1980s. These arguments usually rely on the idea that the paycheck calendar could match other years if the company reused an old check template, or if the workweek did not start exactly when players assume. However, these explanations require more speculation and do not align as cleanly with the later law established in subsequent games. Another small group suggests a later date, such as the mid-1990s. Their reasoning is that the technology and setting could still plausibly exist during that period. While that is technically true, those theories struggle to explain why the paycheck date lines up so neatly with the 1993 calendar, or why the bite of 87 is spoken about as a relatively recent memory. Because the creator of the series intentionally leaves many details ambiguous, absolute certainty is impossible. The timeline of Five Nights at Freddy's is famous for its complexity and occasional contradictions. New games sometimes reinterpret older clues or introduce additional events that force fans to reconsider earlier assumptions. Even so, when examining the evidence available from the first game and its immediate context, the conclusion that the story takes place in 1993 remains the most widely accepted interpretation. In summary, the first Five Nights at Freddy's game appears to be set during the early 1990s, most likely in the year 1993. This conclusion comes from the economic details matching the minimum wage of the period, the technological environment fitting the surveillance systems of the time, and the broader law timeline referencing earlier events like the bite of 87 and the missing children incident. When all these elements are considered together, they form a consistent narrative that places the haunted nights at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza in 1993 during the final days of a struggling and deeply troubled restaurant.